Part 2. The Valley of Death. Farewell music. Even your sweetest tunes are best kept silent. The Taliban on the edge of the village have stilled all lips. 9. Radio Mullah. I was 10 when the Taliban came to our valley. Moniba and I had been reading the Twilight books and longed to be vampires. It seemed to us that the Taliban arrived in the night just like vampires. They appeared in groups, armed with knives and Kalashnikovs, and first emerged in Upper Swat, in the hilly areas of Matta. They didn't call themselves Taliban to start with and didn't look like the Afghan Taliban we'd seen in pictures with the turbans and black-rimmed eyes. These were strange-looking men with long straggly hair and beards and camouflage vests over their shalwar kamas, which they wore with the trousers well above the ankle. They had jogging shoes or cheap plastic sandals on their feet, and sometimes stockings over their heads with holes for their eyes, and they blew their noses dirtily into the ends of the turbans. They wore black badges which said Shariat ya Shahadat, Sharia law or martyrdom, and sometimes black turbans, so people called them Torpaki or the Black Turban Brigade. They looked so dark and dirty that my father's friend described them as people deprived of baths and barbers. Their leader was Maulana Fazlullah, a 28-year-old who used to operate the pulley chair to cross the Swat River and whose right leg dragged because of childhood polio. He had studied in the madrasa of Maulana Sufi Muhammad, the founder of the TNSM, and married his daughter. When Sufi Muhammad was imprisoned in a roundup of militant leaders in 2002, Fazlullah had taken over the movement's leadership. It was shortly before the earthquake that Fazlullah had appeared in Imam Deri, a small village just a few miles outside Mingora on the other side of the Swat River, and set up his illegal radio station. In our valley we received most of our information from the radio because so many had no TV or are illiterate. Soon everyone seemed to be talking about the radio station. It became known as Mullah FM and Fazlullah as the Radio Mullah. It broadcast every night from 8 to 10 and again in the morning from 7 to 9. In the beginning Fazlullah was very wise. He introduced himself as an Islamic reformer and an interpreter of the Quran. My mother is very devout, and to start with she liked Fazlullah. He used his station to encourage people to adopt good habits and abandon practices he said were bad. He said men should keep the beards but give up smoking and using the tobacco they like to chew. He said people should stop using heroin, and chars, which is our word for hashish. He told people the correct way to do their ablutions for prayers, which body part to wash first. He even told people how they should wash the private parts. Sometimes his voice was reasonable, like when adults are trying to persuade you to do something you don't want to, and sometimes it was scary and full of fire. Often he would weep as he spoke of his love for Islam. Usually he spoke for a while, then his deputy Shah Duran came on air, a man who used to sell snacks from a tricycle in the bazaar. They warned people to stop listening to music, watching movies and dancing. Sinful acts like these had caused the earthquake, Fazlullah thundered, and if people didn't stop they would again invite the wrath of God. Mullahs often misinterpret the Quran and Hadith when they teach them in our country as few people understand the original Arabic. Fazlullah exploited this ignorance. Is he right, Abba? I asked my father. I remembered how frightening the earthquake had been. No, Yani, he replied. He is just fooling people. My father said the radio station was the talk of the staff room. By then our schools had about 70 teachers, around 40 men and 30 women. Some of the teachers were anti-Fazlullah but many supported him. People thought that he was a good interpreter of the Holy Quran and admired his charisma. They liked his talk of bringing back Islamic law as everyone was frustrated with the Pakistani justice system, which had replaced ours when we were merged into the country. Cases such as land disputes, common in our area, which used to be resolved quickly now took 10 years to come to court. Everyone wanted to see the back of the corrupt government officials sent into the valley. It was almost as if they thought Fazlullah would recreate our old princely state from the time of the Wali. Within 6 months people were getting rid of the TVs, DVDs and CDs. Fazlullah's men collected them into huge heaps on the streets and set them on fire, creating clouds of thick black smoke that reached high into the sky. Hundreds of CD and DVD shops closed voluntarily and their owners were paid compensation by the Taliban. My brothers and I were worried as we loved our TV, but my father reassured us that we were not getting rid of it. To be safe, we moved it into a cupboard and watched it with the volume low. The Taliban were known to listen at people's doors, then force their way in, take the TVs and smash them to pieces on the street. Fazlullah hated the Bollywood movies we so loved, which he denounced as un-Islamic. Only the radio was allowed, and all music except for Taliban songs was declared haram. One day my father went to visit a friend in hospital and found lots of patients listening to cassettes of Fazlullah's sermons. "You must meet Maulana Fazlullah," people told him. "He's a great scholar. He's actually a high school dropout whose real name isn't even Fazlullah," my father retorted, but they wouldn't listen. My father became depressed because people had begun to embrace Fazlullah's words and his religious romanticism. "It's ridiculous," my father would say, "that this so-called scholar is spreading ignorance." Fazlullah was particularly popular in remote areas where people remembered how TNSM volunteers had helped during the earthquake when the government was nowhere to be seen. On some mosques they set up speakers connected to radios so his broadcasts could be heard by everyone in the village and in the fields. The most popular part of his show came every evening when he would read out people's names. He'd say, "Mr. So-and-so was smoking chars but has stopped because it's sinful," or "Mr. X has kept his beard and I congratulate him," or "Mr. Y voluntarily closed down his CD shop." He told them they would have their reward in the hereafter. People liked to hear the names on the radio. They also liked to hear which of their neighbors were sinful so they could gossip. "Have you heard about so-and-so?" Mullah FM made jokes about the army. Fazlullah denounced Pakistani government officials as infidels, and said they were opposed to bringing in Sharia law. He said that if they did not implement it, his men would enforce it and tear them to pieces. One of his favorite subjects was the injustice of the feudal system of the Khans. Poor people were happy to see the Khans getting the comeuppance. They saw Fazlullah as a kind of Robin Hood and believed that when Fazlullah took over he would give the Khans land to the poor. Some of the Khans fled. My father was against Khanism, but he said the Taliban were worse. My father's friend Hidayatullah had become a government official in Peshawar and warned us. This is how these militants work. They want to win the hearts and minds of the people so they first see what the local problems are and target those responsible, and that way they get the support of the silent majority. That's what they did in Waziristan when they went after kidnappers and bandits. After, when they get power, they behave like the criminals they once hunted down. Fazlullah's broadcasts were often aimed at women. He must have known that many of our men were away from home, working in coal mines in the south or on building sites in the Gulf. Sometimes he would say, "Men, go outside now. I am talking to the women." Then he'd say, "Women are meant to fulfill their responsibilities in the home. Only in emergencies can they go outside, but then they must wear the veil." Sometimes his men would display the fancy clothes that they said they had taken from decadent women, to shame them. My friends at school said their mothers listened to the Radio Mullah, although our headmistress Madam Mayam told us not to. At home we only had my grandfather's old radio, which was broken, but my mother's friends all listened and told her what they heard. They praised Fazlullah and talked of his long hair, the way he rode a horse and behaved like the Prophet. Women would tell him the dreams and he would pray for them. My mother enjoyed these stories, but my father was horrified. I was confused by Fazlullah's words. In the Holy Quran it is not written that men should go outside and women should work all day in the home. In our Islamic studies class at school we used to write essays entitled, "How the Prophet Lived." We learned that the first wife of the Prophet was a businesswoman called Khadija. She was 15 years older than him, and she had been married before, yet he still married her. I also knew from watching my own mother that Pashtun women are very powerful and strong. Her mother, my grandmother, had looked after all 8 children alone after my grandfather had an accident and broke his pelvis and could not leave his bed for 8 years. A man goes out to work, he earns a wage, he comes back home, he eats, he sleeps. That's what he does. Our men think earning money and ordering around others is where power lies. They don't think power is in the hands of the woman who takes care of everyone all day long, and gives birth to the children. In our house my mother managed everything because my father was so busy. It was my mother who would wake up early in the morning, iron our school clothes, make our breakfast and teach us how to behave. It was my mother who would go to the market, shop for us and cook. All those things she did. In the first year of the Taliban I had 2 operations, one to take out my appendix and the other to remove my tonsils. Kushal had his appendix out too. It was my mother who took us to hospital, my father just visited us and brought ice cream. Yet my mother still believed it was written in the Quran that women should not go out and women should not talk to men other than relatives they cannot marry. My father would say to her, Pekai, purdah is not only in the veil, purdah is in the heart. Lots of women were so moved by what Fazlullah said that they gave him gold and money, particularly in poor villages or households where the husbands were working abroad. Tables were set up for the women to hand over their wedding bangles and necklaces and women queued up to do so or sent the sons. Some gave their life savings, believing that this would make God happy. He began building a vast red brick headquarters in Imam Deri complete with a madrasa, a mosque and walls and levees to protect it from the Swat river. No one knew where he got the cement and iron bars from, but the workforce was local. Every village had to take turns sending their men for a day to help build it. One day one of our Urdu teachers, Nawab Ali, told my father, I won't be coming to school tomorrow. When my father asked why, he explained it was his villagers' turn to work on Fazlullah's buildings. Your prime responsibility is to teach the students, replied my father. No, I have to do this, said Nawab Ali. My father came home fuming. If people volunteered in the same way to construct schools or roads or even clear the river of plastic wrappers, by God, Pakistan would become a paradise within a year, he said. The only charity they know is to give to mosque and madrasa. A few weeks later the same teacher told him that he could no longer teach girls as the Maulana doesn't like it. My father tried to change his mind. I agree that female teachers should educate girls, he said. But first we need to educate our girls so they can become teachers. One day Sufi Muhammad proclaimed from jail that there should be no education for women even at girls' madrasas. If someone can show any example in history where Islam allows a female madrasa, they can come and piss on my beard, he said. Then the Radio Mullah turned his attention to schools. He began speaking against school administrators and congratulating girls by name who left school. Miss so-and-so has stopped going to school and will go to heaven, he'd say, or Miss X of Y village has stopped education at class 5. I congratulate her. Girls like me who still went to school he called buffaloes and sheep. My friends and I couldn't understand why it was so wrong. Why don't they want girls to go to school? I asked my father. They are scared of the pen, he replied. Then another teacher at our school, a maths teacher with long hair, also refused to teach girls. My father fired him, but some other teachers were worried and sent a delegation to his office. Sir, don't do this, they pleaded. These are bad days. Let him stay and we will cover for him. Every day it seemed a new edict came. Fazlullah closed beauty parlors and banned shaving so there was no work for barbers. My father, who only has a moustache, insisted he would not grow a beard for the Taliban. The Taliban told women not to go to the bazaar. I didn't mind not going to the China bazaar. I didn't enjoy shopping, unlike my mother, who liked beautiful clothes even though we didn't have much money. My mother always told me, hide your face, people are looking at you. I would reply, "It doesn't matter, I'm also looking at 'em," and she'd get so cross. My mother and her friends were upset about not being able to go shopping, particularly in the days before the Eid holidays, when we beautify ourselves and go to the stalls lit up by fairy lights that sell bangles and henna. All of that stopped. The women would not be attacked if they went to the market, but the Taliban would shout at them and threaten them until they stayed at home. One Talib could intimidate a whole village. We children were cross too. Normally there are new film releases for the holidays, but Fazlullah had closed the DVD shops. Around this time my mother also got tired of Fazlullah, especially when he began to preach against education and insist that those who went to school would also go to hell. Next Fazlullah began holding a shura, a kind of local court. People liked this as justice was speedy, unlike in Pakistani courts, where you could wait years and have to pay bribes to be heard. People began going to Fazlullah and his men to resolve grievances about anything from business matters to personal feuds. I had a 30-year-old problem and it's been resolved in one go, one man told my father. The punishments decreed by Fazlullah's shura included public whippings, which we had never seen before. One of my father's friends told him he had seen 3 men publicly flogged after the shura had found them guilty of involvement in the abduction of 2 women. A stage was set up near Fazlullah's center, and after going to hear him give Friday prayers, hundreds of people gathered to watch the floggings, shouting, "Allahu Akbar! God is great!" with each lash. Sometimes Fazlullah appeared galloping in on a black horse. His men stopped health workers giving polio drops, saying the vaccinations were an American plot to make Muslim women infertile so that the people of Swat would die out. To cure a disease before its onset is not in accordance with Sharia law, said Fazlullah on the radio. You will not find a single child to drink a drop of the vaccine anywhere in Swat. Fazlullah's men patrolled the streets looking for offenders against his decrees, just like the Taliban morality police we had heard about in Afghanistan. They set up volunteer traffic police called Falcon Commandos, who drove through the streets with machine guns mounted on top of the pickup trucks. Some people were happy. One day my father ran into his bank manager. One good thing Fazlullah is doing is banning ladies and girls from going to the China Bazaar, which saves us men money, he said. Few spoke out. My father complained that most people were like our local barber, who one day grumbled to my father that he had only 80 rupees in his till, less than a tenth of what his takings used to be. Just a day before, the barber had told a journalist that the Taliban were good Muslims. After Mullah FM had been on air for about a year, Fazlullah became more aggressive. His brother Maulana Liaquat, along with 3 of Liaquat's sons, were among those killed in an American drone attack on the madrasa in Bajaur at the end of October 2006. 80 people were killed, including boys as young as 12, some of whom had come from Swat. We were all horrified by the attack and people swore revenge. 10 days later, a suicide bomber blew himself up in the army barracks at Dargai, on the way from Islamabad to Swat, and killed 42 Pakistani soldiers. At that time suicide bombings were rare in Pakistan. There were 6 in total that year, and it was the biggest attack that had ever been carried out by Pakistani militants. At Eid we usually sacrifice animals like goats or sheep. But Fazlullah said, on this Eid 2-legged animals will be sacrificed. We soon saw what he meant. His men began killing Khans and political activists from secular and nationalist parties, especially the Awami National Party, ANP. In January 2007, a close friend of one of my father's friends was kidnapped in his village by 80 masked gunmen. His name was Malik Bakht Bader. He was from a wealthy Khan family and the local vice president of the ANP. His body was found dumped in his family's ancestral graveyard. His legs and arms had all been broken. It was the first targeted killing in Swat, and people said it was because he had helped the army find Taliban hideouts. The authorities turned a blind eye. Our provincial government was still made up of mullah parties who wouldn't criticize anyone who claimed to be fighting for Islam. At first we thought we were safe in Mingora, the biggest town in Swat. But Fazlullah's headquarters were just a few miles away, and even though the Taliban were not near our house, they were in the markets, in the streets and the hills. Danger began to creep closer. During Eid we went to our family village as usual. I was in my cousin's car, and as we drove through a river where the road had been washed away, we had to stop at a Taliban checkpoint. I was in the back with my mother. My cousin quickly gave us his music cassettes to hide in our purses. The Taliban were dressed in black and carried Kalashnikovs. They told us, "Sisters, you are bringing shame. You must wear burqas." When we arrived back at school after Eid, we saw a letter taped to the gate. "Sir, the school you are running is Western and infidel," it said. "You teach girls and have a uniform that is un-Islamic. Stop this or you will be in trouble and your children will weep and cry for you." It was signed, Fedayeen of Islam. My father decided to change the boys' uniform from shirt and trousers to shalwar kameez, baggy pajama-like trousers and a long shirt. Ours remained a royal blue shalwar kameez with a white dupatta, or headscarf, and we were advised to keep our heads covered coming in and out of school. His friend Hidayatullah told him to stand firm. "Zierdan, you have charisma, you can speak up and organize against them," he said. "Life isn't just about taking in oxygen and giving out carbon dioxide. You can stay there accepting everything from the Taliban or you can make a stand against them." My father told us what Hidayatullah had said. He then wrote a letter to the Daily Azadi, our local newspaper. "To the Fedayeen of Islam, or Islamic sacrifices, this is not the right way to implement Islam," he wrote. "Please don't harm my children because the God you believe in is the same God they pray to every day. You can take my life but please don't kill my school children." When my father saw the newspaper he was very unhappy. The letter had been buried on an inside page and the editor had published his name and the address of the school, which my father had not expected him to do. But lots of people called to congratulate him. "You have put the first stone in standing water," they said. "Now we will have the courage to speak." 10. Toffees, tennis balls and the Buddhas of Swat. First the Taliban took our music, then our Buddhas, then our history. One of our favorite things was going on school trips. We were lucky to live in a paradise like Swat with so many beautiful places to visit, waterfalls, lakes, the ski resort, the Wali's palace, the Buddha statues, the tomb of Akhund of Swat. All these places told our special story. We would talk about the trips for weeks beforehand, then, when the day finally came, we dressed up in our best clothes and piled into buses along with pots of chicken and rice for a picnic. Some of us had cameras and took photographs. At the end of the day my father would make us all take turns standing on a rock and tell stories about what we had seen. When Fazlullah came there were no more school trips. Girls were not supposed to be seen outside. The Taliban destroyed the Buddhist statues and stupas where we played, which had been there for thousands of years and were a part of our history from the time of the Kushan kings. They believed any statue or painting was haram, sinful and therefore prohibited. One black day they even dynamited the face of the Jehanabad Buddha, which was carved into a hillside just half an hour's drive from Mingora and towered 23 feet into the sky. Archaeologists say it was almost as important as the Buddhas of Bamiyan, which the Afghan Taliban blew up. It took them 2 goes to destroy it. The first time they drilled holes in the rock and filled them with dynamite, but that didn't work. A few weeks later, on the 8th of October 2007, they tried again. This time they obliterated the Buddha's face, which had watched over the valley since the 7th century. The Taliban became the enemy of fine art, culture and our history. The Swat Museum moved its collection away for safekeeping. They destroyed everything old and brought nothing new. The Taliban took over the Emerald Mountain with its mine and began selling the beautiful stones to buy their ugly weapons. They took money from the people who chopped down our precious trees for timber and then demanded more money to let the trucks pass. Their radio coverage spread across the valley and neighboring districts. Though we still had our television, they had switched off the cable channels. Moniba and I could no longer watch our favorite Bollywood shows like Shararat or Making Mischief. It seemed like the Taliban didn't want us to do anything. They even banned one of our favorite board games called Carrom, in which we flick counters across a wooden board. We heard stories that the Taliban would hear children laughing and burst into the room and smash the boards. We felt like the Taliban saw us as little dolls to control, telling us what to do and how to dress. I thought if God wanted us to be like that, he wouldn't have made us all different. One day we found our teacher Miss Hameda in floods of tears. Her husband was a policeman in the small town of Matta, and Fazlullah's men had stormed in and some police officers had been killed, including her husband. It was the first Taliban attack on the police in our valley. Soon they had taken over many villages. The black and white flags of Fazlullah's TNSM started appearing on police stations. The militants would enter villages with megaphones and the police would flee. In a short time they had taken over 59 villages and set up their own parallel administrations. Policemen were so scared of being killed that they took out adverts in the newspapers to announce they had left the force. All this happened and nobody did a thing. It was as though everyone was in a trance. My father said people had been seduced by Fazlullah. Some joined his men, thinking they would have better lives. My father tried to counter the propaganda, but it was hard. I have no militants and no FM radio, he joked. He even dared to enter the Radio Mullah's own village one day to speak at a school. He crossed the river in one of the metal boxes suspended from a pulley that we use as makeshift bridges. On the way he saw smoke so high it touched the clouds, the blackest smoke he'd ever seen. At first he thought it might be a brick factory, but as he approached he saw bearded figures in turbans burning TVs and computers. In the school my father told the people, "I saw your villagers burning these things. Don't you realize the only ones who will profit are the companies in Japan, who will just make more?" Someone came up to him and whispered, "Don't speak any more in this way, it's risky." Meanwhile the authorities, like most people, did nothing. It felt as though the whole country was going mad. The rest of Pakistan was preoccupied with something else. The Taliban had moved right into the heart of our nation's capital, Islamabad. We saw pictures on the news of what people were calling the Burqa Brigade, young women and girls like us in burqas with sticks, attacking CD and DVD shops in bazaars in the center of Islamabad. The women were from Jamia Hafsa, the biggest female madrasa in our country and part of Lal Masjid, the Red Mosque in Islamabad. It was built in 1965 and got its name from its red walls. It's just a few blocks from Parliament and the headquarters of ISI, and many government officials and military used to pray there. The mosque has two madrasas, one for girls and one for boys, which had been used for years to recruit and train volunteers to fight in Afghanistan and Kashmir. It was run by two brothers, Abdulaziz and Abdul Rashid, and had become a center for spreading propaganda about bin Laden, whom Abdul Rashid had met in Kandahar when visiting Mullah Omar. The brothers were famed for their fiery sermons and attracted thousands of worshippers, particularly after 9/11. When President Musharraf agreed to help America in the war on terror, the mosque broke off its long links with the military and became a center of protest against the government. Abdul Rashid was even accused of being part of a plot to blow up Musharraf's convoy in Rawalpindi in December 2003. Investigators said the explosives used had been stored in Lal Masjid. But a few months later he was cleared. When Musharraf sent troops into the FATA, starting with Waziristan in 2004, the brothers led a campaign declaring the military action un-Islamic. They had their own website and pirate FM station on which they broadcast, just like Fazlullah. Around the same time as our Taliban were emerging in Swat, the girls of the Red Mosque Madrasa began terrorizing the streets of Islamabad. They raided houses they claimed were being used as massage centers, they kidnapped women they said were prostitutes and closed down DVD shops, again making bonfires of CDs and DVDs. When it suits the Taliban, women can be vocal and visible. The head of the madrasa was Hassan, the wife of the elder brother, Abdul Aziz, and she even boasted that she had trained many of her girls to become suicide bombers. The mosque also set up its own courts to dispense Islamic justice, saying the state had failed. Their militants kidnapped policemen and ransacked government buildings. The Musharraf government didn't seem to know what to do. This was perhaps because the military had been so attached to the mosque. But by the middle of 2007 the situation was so bad that people began to worry the militants could take over the capital. It was almost unbelievable. Islamabad is usually a quiet, orderly place, very different to the rest of our country. Finally, on the evening of the 3rd of July, commandos with tanks and armored personnel carriers surrounded the mosque. They cut off the electricity in the area, and as dusk fell there was a sudden burst of gunfire and explosions. The troops blasted holes in the walls surrounding the mosque and fired mortars at the compound as helicopter gunships hovered overhead. Over loudspeakers they called for the girls to surrender. Many of the militants in the mosque had fought in Afghanistan or Kashmir. They barricaded themselves and the madrasa students inside concrete bunkers with sandbags. Worried parents gathered outside, calling the daughters on mobile phones, begging them to come out. Some of the girls refused, saying the teachers had taught them that to become a martyr is a glorious thing. The next evening a small group of girls emerged. Hidden among them was Abdul Aziz, disguised in a burqa, along with his daughter. But his wife and younger brother stayed inside, along with many students, and there were daily exchanges of gunfire between the militants and the troops outside. The militants had RPGs and petrol bombs made from Sprite bottles. The siege went on until late on the 9th of July, when the commander of the special forces outside was killed by a sniper in one of the minarets. The military finally lost patience and stormed the compound. They called it Operation Silence, although it was very loud. Never had there been such a battle in the heart of our capital. Commandos fought from room to room for hours until they finally tracked Abdul Rashid and his followers to a basement where they killed him. By nightfall on the 10th of July, when the siege was finally over, around 100 people had been killed, including several soldiers and a number of children. The news showed shocking pictures of the wreckage, everywhere blood and broken glass, and dead bodies. We all watched in horror. Some of the students at the two madrasas were from Swat. How could something like that happen in our capital city and in a mosque? A mosque is a sacred place for us. It was after the Red Mosque siege that the Swat Taliban changed. On the 12th of July, which I remember because it was my birthday, Fazlullah gave a radio address that was quite different to his previous ones. He raged against the Lal Masjid attack and vowed to avenge the death of Abdul Rashid. Then he declared war on the Pakistani government. This was the start of real trouble. Fazlullah could now carry out his threats and mobilize support for his Taliban in the name of Lal Masjid. A few days later they attacked an army convoy traveling in the direction of Swat and killed 13 soldiers. The backlash wasn't just in Swat. There was an enormous protest by tribesmen in Bajaur and a wave of suicide bombings across the country. There was one ray of hope: Benazir Bhutto was returning. The Americans were worried that their ally General Musharraf was too unpopular in Pakistan to be effective against the Taliban, so they had helped broker an unlikely power-sharing deal. The plan was that Musharraf would finally take off his uniform and be a civilian president, supported by Benazir's party. In return he would drop corruption charges against her and her husband and agree to hold elections, which everyone assumed would result in Benazir becoming prime minister. No Pakistani, including my father, thought this deal would work, as Musharraf and Benazir hated each other. Benazir had been in exile since I was 2 years old, but I had heard so much about her from my father and was very excited that she would return and we might have a woman leader once more. It was because of Benazir that girls like me could think of speaking out and becoming politicians. She was our role model. She symbolized the end of dictatorship and the beginning of democracy as well. as sending a message of hope and strength to the rest of the world. She was also our only political leader to speak out against the militants and even offered to help American troops hunt for bin Laden inside Pakistani borders. Some people obviously did not like that. On the 18th of October 2007, we were all glued to the TV as she walked down the steps of the plane in Karachi and wept as she stepped onto Pakistani soil after almost 9 years in exile. When she paraded on an open-top bus through the streets, hundreds of thousands of people flocked to see her. They had traveled from all over the country and many of them were carrying small children. Some released white doves, one of which flew to perch on Benazir's shoulder. The crowds were so large that the bus moved at a walking pace. We stopped watching after a while as it was clearly going to take hours. I had gone to bed when just before midnight the militants struck. Benazir's bus was blown up in a wave of orange flame. My father told me the news when I woke up the next morning. He and his friends were in such a state of shock that they had not gone to bed. Luckily, Benazir survived because she had gone downstairs to an armored compartment to rest her feet just before the explosions, but 150 people had been killed. It was the biggest bomb ever to have gone off in our country. Many of the dead were students who had made a human chain around the bus. They called themselves martyrs for Benazir. At school that day everyone was subdued, even those who had opposed Benazir. We were devastated but also thankful that she had survived. About a week later the army came to Swat, making lots of noise with the jeeps and helicopters. We were at school when the helicopters first arrived and were very excited. We ran outside and they threw toffees and tennis balls down to us, which we rushed to catch. Helicopters were a rare sight in Swat, but since our house was close to the local army headquarters they sometimes flew right over us. We used to hold competitions for who would collect the most toffees. One day a man from along the street came and told us that it had been announced in the mosques that there would be a curfew the next day. We didn't know what a curfew was and were anxious. There was a hole in the wall to our neighbor's house, Safina's family, through which we used to communicate with them, and we knocked on the wall so they would come to the hole. "What does it mean, this curfew?" we asked. When they explained, we didn't even come out of our rooms because we thought something bad might happen. Later the curfew took over our lives. We heard on the news that Musharraf had sent 3,000 troops into our valley to confront the Taliban. They occupied all government and private buildings which they thought were of strategic importance. Until then it had seemed as if the rest of Pakistan was ignoring what was happening in Swat. The following day a suicide bomber attacked another army truck in Swat, killing 17 soldiers and 13 civilians. Then all that night we heard da da da, the boom of cannons and machine guns from the hills. It was hard to sleep. On the TV the next day we heard that fighting had erupted in the hills to the north. School was closed and we stayed at home, trying to understand what was going on. The fighting was taking place outside Mingora, though we could still hear gunfire. The military said it had killed more than 100 militants, but then on the first day of November around 700 Taliban overran an army position at Kwazakala. Some 50 men deserted from the Frontier Corps and another 48 were captured and then paraded around. Fazlullah's men humiliated them by taking their uniforms and guns and giving them each 500 rupees to make their way back. The Taliban then took 2 police stations in Kwazakala and moved on to Madian, where more police officers gave up their weapons. Very quickly the Taliban controlled most of Swat outside Mingora. On the 12th of November Musharraf ordered 10,000 more troops into our valley with additional helicopter gunships. The army was everywhere. They even camped on the golf course, the big guns trained on the hillsides. They then launched an operation against Fazlullah which later became known as the First Battle of Swat. It was the first time the army had launched an operation against its own people outside the Fatah. Police once tried to capture Fazlullah when he was speaking at a gathering, but a giant sandstorm blew up and he managed to escape. This added to his mystery and spiritual reputation. The militants did not give up easily. Instead they advanced to the east and on the 16th of November captured Alpuri, the main town of Shangla. Again local police fled without a fight. People there said Chechens and Uzbeks were among the fighters. We worried about our family in Shangla, though my father said the village was too remote for the Taliban to bother with and local people had made it clear they would keep them out. The Pakistan army had far more men and heavy weapons, so they quickly managed to recapture the valley. They took Imam Deri, the headquarters of Fazlullah. The militants fled to the forests and by early December the army said they had cleared most areas. Fazlullah retreated into the mountains. But they did not drive the Taliban away. This will not last, my father predicted. Fazlullah's group was not the only one causing havoc. All across northwestern Pakistan different militant groups had emerged led by people from various tribal groups. About a week after the Battle of Swat, 40 Taliban leaders from across our province met in South Waziristan to declare war on Pakistan. They agreed to form a united front under the banner of Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan, TTP, or the Pakistan Taliban, and claimed to have 40,000 fighters between them. They chose as their leader a man in his late 30s called Baitullah Masood, who had fought in Afghanistan. Fazlullah was made chief of the Swat sector. When the army arrived we thought that the fighting would soon stop, but we were wrong. There was much more to come. The Taliban targeted not only politicians, MPs and the police, but also people who were not observing purdah, wearing the wrong length of beard or the wrong kind of shalwar kameez. On the 27th of December Benazir Bhutto addressed an election rally in Liaquat Bagh, the park in Rawalpindi where our first Prime Minister, Liaquat Ali, was assassinated. We will defeat the forces of extremism and militancy with the power of the people, she declared to loud cheers. She was in a special bulletproof Toyota Land Cruiser, and as it left the park she stood up on the seat and popped her head through the sunroof to wave to supporters. Suddenly there was the crack of gunfire and an explosion as a suicide bomber blew himself up by the side of her vehicle. Benazir slid back down. The Musharraf government later said she hit her head on the roof handle. Other people said she had been shot. We were watching the TV when the news came through. My grandmother said, Benazir will become Shaheed, meaning she would die an honorable death. We all started crying and praying for her. When we learned she was dead, my heart said to me, why don't you go there and fight for women's rights? We were looking forward to democracy and now people asked, if Benazir can die, nobody is safe. It felt as if my country was running out of hope. Musharraf blamed Benazir's death on Baitullah Masood, the TTP leader, and released a transcript of an intercepted phone call that was supposed to be between him and a fellow militant discussing the attack. Baitullah denied responsibility, which was unusual for the Taliban. We used to have Islamic studies teachers, Nuri Sahibs, who came to our home to teach the Quran to me and other local children. By the time the Taliban came I had finished my recitation of the complete Quran, what we call Khatam al-Quran, much to the delight of Baba, my grandfather the cleric. We recite in Arabic, and most people don't actually know what the verses mean, but I had also started learning them in translation. To my horror one Nuri Sahib tried to justify Benazir's assassination. It was a very good job she was killed, he said. When she was alive she was useless. She was not following Islam properly. If she had lived there would have been anarchy. I was shocked and told my father, we don't have any option. We are dependent on these mullahs to learn the Quran, he said. But you just use him to learn the literal meaning of the words, don't follow his explanations and interpretation. Only learn what God says. His words are divine messages, which you are free and independent to interpret. 11. The clever class. It was school that kept me going in those dark days. When I was in the street it felt as though every man I passed might be a Talib. We hid our school bags and our books in our shawls. My father always said that the most beautiful thing in a village in the morning is the sight of a child in a school uniform, but now we were afraid to wear them. We had moved up to high school. Madam Mayam said no one wanted to teach our class as we asked so many questions. We liked to be known as the clever girls. When we decorated our hands with henna for holidays and weddings, we drew calculus and chemical formulae instead of flowers and butterflies. My rivalry with Malala continued, but after the shock of being beaten by her when she first joined our school, I worked hard and had managed to regain my position on the school honors board for first in class. She usually came second and Moniba third. The teachers told us examiners first looked at how much we had written, then presentation. Moniba had the most beautiful writing and presentation of the three of us, but I always told her she did not trust herself enough. She worked hard as she worried that if she got low marks her male relatives might use it as an excuse to stop her education. I was weakest in maths once I got 0 in a test, but I worked hard at it. My chemistry teacher Sir Ubaidullah, we called all our teachers Sir or Miss, said I was a born politician because, at the start of oral exams, I would always say, "Sir, can I just say you are the best teacher and yours is my favorite class." Some parents complained that I was being favored because my father owned the school, but people were always surprised that despite our rivalry we were all good friends and not jealous of each other. We also competed in what we call board exams. These would select the best students from private schools in the district, and one year Malala and I got exactly the same marks. We did another paper at school to see who would get the prize and again we got equal marks. So people wouldn't think I was getting special treatment, my father arranged for us to do papers at another school, that of his friend Ahmad Shah. Again we got the same, so we both got the prize. There was more to school than work. We liked performing plays. I wrote a sketch based on Romeo and Juliet about corruption. I played Romeo as a civil servant interviewing people for a job. The first candidate is a beautiful girl, and he asks her very easy questions such as, how many wheels does a bicycle have? When she replies, 2, he says, you are so brilliant. The next candidate is a man, so Romeo asks him impossible things like, without leaving your chair tell me the make of the fan in the room above us. How could I possibly know? Asks the candidate. You're telling me you have a PhD and you don't know. Replies Romeo. He decides to give the job to the girl. The girl was played by Moniba, of course, and another classmate Atiya played the part of my assistant to add some salt, pepper and masala with her wittier sides. Everyone laughed a lot. I like to mimic people, and in breaks my friends used to beg me to impersonate our teachers, particularly Sir Ubaidullah. With all the bad stuff going on in those days, we needed small reasons to laugh. The army action at the end of 2007 had not got rid of the Taliban. The army had stayed in Swat and were everywhere in the town, yet Fazlullah still broadcast every day on the radio, and throughout 2008 the situation was even worse than before with bomb blasts and killings. All we talked about in those days was the army and the Taliban and the feeling that we were caught between the two. Atiya used to tease me by saying, Taliban is good, army not good. I replied, if there is a snake and a lion coming to attack us, what would we say is good, the snake or lion? Our school was a haven from the horrors outside. All the other girls in my class wanted to be doctors, but I decided I wanted to be an inventor and make an anti-Taliban machine which would sniff them out and destroy the guns. But of course at school we were under threat too, and some of my friends dropped out. Fazlullah kept broadcasting that girls should stay at home, and his men had started blowing up schools, usually during nighttime curfew when the children were not there. The first school to be blown up was Shawa Zangay, a government girls' primary school in Matta. We couldn't believe anyone would do such a thing. Then many more bombings followed, almost every day. Even in Mingora, there were explosions. Twice bombs went off when I was in the kitchen, so close by that the whole house rattled and the fan above the window fell down. I became very scared of going into the kitchen and would only run in and out. On the last day of February 2008 I was in the kitchen when we heard an enormous blast. It was ear-shatteringly loud and obviously close by. As we always did, we called to each other to make sure we were all safe. Chorister, Pashot, Bibi, Kushal, Atal. Then we heard sirens, one after another, as if all the ambulances of Mingora were passing. A suicide bomber had struck in the basketball court at Haji Baba High School. Funeral prayers had been underway for a popular local police officer, Javed Iqbal, who had been killed by a suicide bomber in a remote area while trying to escape from the Taliban. He was from Mingora, and his body had been brought back for the funeral and a police salute. Now the Taliban had bombed the mourners. More than 55 people were killed, including Javed Iqbal's young son and many people we knew. 10 members of Moniba's family were there and were either killed or injured. Moniba was devastated and the whole town was in shock. There were condolences in every mosque. Are you scared now? I asked my father. At night our fear is strong, Yani, he told me. But in the morning, in the light, we find our courage again. And this is true for my family. We were scared, but our fear was not as strong as our courage. We must rid our valley of the Taliban, and then no one has to feel this fear, he said. In times of crisis we Pashtuns resort to the old trusted ways, so in 2008 elders in Swat created an assembly called the Qomi Jigar to challenge Fazlullah. 3 local men, Mukhtar Khan Yusufzai, Khurshid Karkarji and Zahid Khan went from Hujra to Hujra persuading elders to join together. The senior elder was a white-bearded man of 74 called Abdul Khan Khalik, who had been one of the Queen's bodyguards when she had visited Swat to stay with our wali. Even though my father was not an elder or a Khan, he was chosen as spokesperson as he was not afraid to speak out. Though he was more poetic in Pashto, he could speak our national language, Urdu, and English fluently, which meant he was an effective communicator outside Swat as well as inside. Every day, on behalf of the Swat Council of Elders, he was at seminars or on the media challenging Fazlullah. What are you doing? He would ask. You are playing havoc with our lives and our culture. My father would say to me, any organization which works for peace, I will join. If you want to resolve a dispute or come out from conflict, the very first thing is to speak the truth. If you have a headache and tell the doctor you have a stomachache, how can the doctor help? You must speak the truth. The truth will abolish fear. When he met his fellow activists, particularly his old friends Ahmad Shah, Muhammad Farooq and Zahid Khan, I often went with him. Ahmad Shah also had a school, where Muhammad Farooq worked, and they would sometimes gather on his lawn. Zahid Khan was a hotel owner and had a big hujra. When they came to our house I would bring them tea, then sit quietly listening as they discussed what to do. Malala is not just the daughter of Zierden, they would say, she is the daughter of all of us. They went back and forth to Peshawar and Islamabad and gave lots of interviews on the radio, particularly to the Voice of America and the BBC, taking turns so there would always be one of them available. They told people that what was happening in Swat was not about Islam. My father said the Taliban presence in Swat was not possible without the support of some in the army and the bureaucracy. The state is meant to protect the rights of its citizens, but it's a very difficult situation when you can't tell the difference between state and non-state and can't trust the state to protect you against non-state. Our military and ISI are very powerful and most people did not like to voice these things publicly, but my father and many of his friends were not scared. What you are doing is against our people and against Pakistan, he would say. Don't support Talibanization, it's inhuman. We are told that Swat is being sacrificed for the sake of Pakistan, but no one and nothing should be sacrificed for the state. A state is like a mother, and a mother never deserts or cheats her children. He hated the fact that most people would not speak up. In his pocket he kept a poem written by Martin Niemöller, who had lived in Nazi Germany. First they came for the communists. And I didn't speak out because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the socialists. And I didn't speak out because I wasn't a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists. And I didn't speak out because I wasn't a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews. And I didn't speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for the Catholics. And I didn't speak out because I was not a Catholic. Then they came for me. And there was no one left to speak for me. I knew he was right. If people were silent, nothing would change. At school, my father organized a peace march and encouraged us to speak out against what was happening. Moniba put it well. We Pashtuns are a religion-loving people, she said. Because of the Taliban, the whole world is claiming we are terrorists. This is not the case. We are peace-loving. Our mountains, our trees, our flowers, everything in our valley is about peace. A group of us girls gave an interview on ATV Khyber, the only privately owned Pashto television channel, about girls dropping out of school due to militancy. Teachers helped us beforehand on how to respond to questions. I wasn't the only one to be interviewed. When we were 11 and 12, we did them together, but as we turned 13 or 14, my friends' brothers and fathers didn't allow them because they had entered puberty and should observe purdah, and also they were afraid. One day I went on Geo, which is one of the biggest news channels in our country. There was a wall of screens in their office. I was astonished to see so many channels. Afterwards I thought, the media needs interviews. They want to interview a small girl, but the girls are scared, and even if they're not, their parents won't allow it. I have a father who isn't scared, who stands by me. He said, you are a child and it's your right to speak. The more interviews I gave, the stronger I felt and the more support we received. I was only 11, but I looked older, and the media seemed to like hearing from a young girl. One journalist called me Takra Jenai, a bright shining young lady, and another said, you are Paka Jenai, you are wise beyond your years. In my heart was the belief that God would protect me. If I am speaking for my rights, for the rights of girls, I am not doing anything wrong. It's my duty to do so. God wants to see how we behave in such situations. There is a saying in the Quran, the falsehood has to go and the truth will prevail. If one man, Fazlullah, can destroy everything, why can't one girl change it? I wondered. I pray to God every night to give me strength. The media in Swat were under pressure to give positive coverage to the Taliban. Some even respectfully called the Taliban spokesman Muslim Khan, school dada, when in reality he was destroying schools. But many local journalists were unhappy about what was happening to their valley, and they gave us a powerful platform as we would say things they didn't dare to. We didn't have a car, so we went by rickshaw, or one of my father's friends would take us to the interviews. One day my father and I went to Peshawar to appear on a BBC Urdu talk show hosted by a famous columnist called Wasatullah Khan. We went with my father's friend Fazl Maula and his daughter. 2 fathers and 2 daughters. To represent the Taliban they had Muslim Khan, who wasn't in the studio. I was a bit nervous, but I knew it was important as many people all over Pakistan would be listening. How dare the Taliban take away my basic right to education? I said. There was no response from Muslim Khan because his phone interview had been pre-recorded. How can a recording respond to live questions? Afterwards people congratulated me. My father laughed and said I should go into politics. Even as a toddler you talk like a politician, he teased. But I never listened to my interviews. I knew these were very small steps. Our words were like the eucalyptus blossoms of spring tossed away on the wind. The destruction of schools continued. On the night of the 7th of October 2008 we heard a series of faraway blasts. The next morning we learned that masked militants had entered the Sangota convent school for girls and the Excelsior College for boys and blown them up using improvised explosive devices, IEDs. The teachers had already been evacuated as they had received threats earlier. These were famous schools, particularly Sangota, which dated from the time of the last wali and was well known for academic excellence. They were also big. Excelsior had over 2,000 pupils and Sangota had 1,000. My father went there after the bombings and found the buildings completely razed to the ground. He gave interviews to TV reporters amid broken bricks and burned books and returned home horrified. "It's all just rubble," he said. Yet my father remained hopeful and believed there would be a day when there was an end to the destruction. What really depressed him was the looting of the destroyed schools. The furniture, the books, the computers were all stolen by local people. He cried when he heard this. "They are vultures jumping on a dead body." The next day he went on a live show on the Voice of America and angrily condemned the attacks. Muslim Khan, the Taliban spokesman, was on the phone. "What was so wrong with these two schools that you should bomb them?" My father asked him. Muslim Khan said that Sangota was a convent school teaching Christianity and that Excelsior was coeducational, teaching girls and boys together. "Both things are false," replied my father. Sangota school has been there since the 1960s and never converted anyone to Christianity. In fact, some of them converted to Islam. And Excelsior is only coeducational in the primary section. Muslim Khan didn't answer. "What about their own daughters?" I asked my father. "Don't they want them to learn?" Our headmistress Madam Mayam had studied at Sangota, and her younger sister Aisha was a pupil there, so she and some of the other Sangota girls transferred to our school. The monthly school fees were never enough to cover all our outgoings, so the extra fees were welcome, but my father was unhappy. He went everywhere he could demanding the reconstruction of both schools. Once he spoke at a big gathering and held up an audience member's baby girl and said, "This girl is our future. Do we want her to be ignorant?" The crowd agreed that they would sacrifice themselves before giving up the daughter's education. The new girls had horrible stories. Aisha told us how one day on the way home from Sangota she had seen a Taliban holding up the severed head of a policeman by its hair, blood dripping from the neck. The Sangota girls were also very bright, which meant more competition. One of them, Rita, was excellent at making speeches. She became a good friend of mine and of Moniba's, which sometimes caused fights as 3 is a tricky number. Moniba often brought food to school and would just bring one spare fork. "Are you my friend or Ryder's?" I asked Moniba. She laughed and said, "We are all 3 good friends." By the end of 2008, around 400 schools had been destroyed by the Taliban. We had a new government under President Asif Zardari, the widower of Benazir, but they didn't seem to care about Swat. I told people things would be different if Zardari's own daughters were at school in Swat. There were suicide bombings all over the country, even the Marriott Hotel in Islamabad had been blown up. In Swat it was safer in the town than in the remote areas, and many of our family came from the countryside to stay with us. The house was small and got very crowded with the cousins who already lived with us. There was little to do. We couldn't play cricket in the street or on the roof like we used to. We played marbles in the yard over and over again. I fought non-stop with my brother Kushal, and he would go crying to our mother. Never in history have Kushal and Malala been friends. I liked doing my hair in different styles and would spend ages in the bathroom in front of the mirror trying out looks I had seen in movies. Until I was 8 or 9 my mother used to cut my hair short like my brother's because of lice and also to make it easier to wash and brush as it would get messed up under my shawl. But finally I had persuaded her to let me grow it to my shoulders. Unlike Moniba, who has straight hair, mine is wavy, and I like to twist it into curls or tie it into plaits. "What are you doing in there for show?" my mother would shout. "Our guests need the bathroom and everyone is having to wait for you." One of the worst times was the fasting month of Ramadan in 2008. During Ramadan no food or drink can pass a Muslim's lips in daylight hours. The Taliban bombed the power station so we had no electricity, then a few days later they blasted the pipeline so we had no gas either. The price of the gas cylinders we used to buy from the market doubled, so my mother had to cook on a fire like we did in the village. She didn't complain, food needed to be cooked and she cooked it, and there were others worse off than us. But there was no clean water and people started dying from cholera. The hospital could not cope with all the patients and had to erect big tents outside to treat people. Though we had no generator at home, my father bought one to install at the school, and fresh water was pumped from a borehole, which all the children in the neighborhood went to collect. Every day, there would be lines of people waiting to fill jugs, bottles and drums. One of the neighbors got frightened. "What are you doing?" he asked. "If the Taliban find out you're giving water in the month of Ramadan, they will bomb us." My father replied that people would die either of thirst or bombings. The days when we used to go for trips or for picnics seemed like a dream. No one would venture from their homes after sunset. The terrorists even blew up the ski lift and the big hotel in Malam Java where tourists used to stay. A holiday paradise turned into a hell where no tourist would venture. Then, at the end of 2008, Fazlullah's deputy Maulana Shah Doran announced on the radio that all girls' schools would close. From the 15th of January, girls must not go to school, he warned. First I thought it was a joke. How can they stop us from going to school? I asked my friends. They don't have the power. They are saying they will destroy the mountain, but they can't even control the road. The other girls didn't agree with me. Who will stop them? They asked. They have already blown up hundreds of schools and no one has done anything. My father used to say the people of Swat and the teachers would continue to educate our children until the last room, the last teacher and the last student was alive. My parents never once suggested I should withdraw from school, ever. Though we loved school, we hadn't realized how important education was until the Taliban tried to stop us. Going to school, reading and doing our homework wasn't just a way of passing time, it was our future. That winter it snowed and we built snow bears, but without much joy. In winter the Taliban used to disappear into the mountains, but we knew they would be back and had no idea what was coming next. We believed school would start again. The Taliban could take our pens and books, but they couldn't stop our minds from thinking. 12. The bloody square. The bodies would be dumped in the square at night so that everyone would see them the next morning on their way to work. There was usually a note pinned to them saying something like, "This is what happens to an army agent," or, "Do not touch this body until 11 a.m. or you will be next." On some of the nights of the killings there would also be earthquakes, which made people even more scared as we connect every natural disaster with a human disaster. They killed Shabana on a bitterly cold night in January 2009. She lived in Ban Bazaar, a narrow street in our town of Mingora which is famous for its dancers and musicians. Shabana's father said a group of men had knocked at her door and asked her to dance for them. She went to put on her dancing clothes, and when she returned to dance for them, they pulled out the guns and threatened to slit her throat. This happened after the 9 p.m. curfew and people heard her screaming, "I promise I'll stop. I promise I won't sing and dance again. Leave me, for God's sake. I am a woman, a Muslim. Don't kill me." Then shots rang out and her bullet-ridden body was dragged to Green Choke. So many bodies had been left there that people started calling it the Bloody Square. We heard about Shabana's death the next morning. On Mullah FM, Fazlullah said she deserved to die for her immoral character and any other girls found performing in Ban Bazaar would be killed one by one. We used to be proud of our music and art in Swat, but now most of the dancers fled to Lahore or to Dubai. Musicians took out adverts in the papers saying they had stopped playing and were pledging to live pious lives to appease the Taliban. People used to talk about Shabana's bad character, but our men both wished to see her dance and also despised her because she was a dancer. A Khan's daughter can't marry a barber's son and a barber's daughter can't marry a Khan's son. We Pashtuns love shoes but don't love the cobbler, we love our scarves and blankets but do not respect the weaver. Manual workers made a great contribution to our society but received no recognition, and this is the reason so many of them joined the Taliban, to finally achieve status and power. So people loved to see Shabana dance but didn't respect her, and when she was murdered they said nothing. Some even agreed with her killing, out of fear of the Taliban or because they were in favor of them. Shabana was not a Muslim, they said. She was bad, and it was right that she was killed. I can't say that was the worst day. Around the time of Shabana's murder, every day seemed like the worst day, every moment was the worst. The bad news was everywhere: this person's place bombed, this school blown up, public whippings. The stories were endless and overwhelming. A couple of weeks after Shabana's murder, a teacher in Matta was killed when he refused to pull his shalwar above the ankle the way the Taliban wore theirs. He told them that nowhere in Islam is this required. They hung him and then they shot his father. I couldn't understand what the Taliban were trying to do. They are abusing our religion, I said in interviews. How will you accept Islam if I put a gun to your head and say Islam is the true religion? If they want every person in the world to be Muslim, why don't they show themselves to be good Muslims first? Regularly my father would come home shaken up due to the terrible things he had witnessed and heard about, such as policemen beheaded, their heads paraded through the town. Even those who had defended Fazlullah at the start, believing his men were the real standard bearers of Islam, and given him the gold, began to turn against him. My father told me about a woman who had donated generously to the Taliban while her husband was working abroad. When he came back and found out she had given away her gold, he was furious. One night there was a small explosion in their village and the wife cried. "Don't cry," said her husband. "That is the sound of your earrings and nose studs. Now listen to the sound of your lockets and bangles." Yet still so few people spoke out. My father's old rival in college politics, Hassan ul-Haq Haqqani, had become a journalist in Islamabad and organized a conference on the situation in Swat. None of the lawyers and academics he invited from Swat to speak turned up. Only my father and some journalists went. It seemed that people had decided the Taliban were here to stay and they had better get along with them. When you are in the Taliban you have 100% life security, people would say. That's why they volunteered the young men. The Taliban would come to people's houses, demanding money to buy Kalashnikovs, or they would ask them to hand over the sons to fight with them. Many of the rich fled. The poor had no choice but to stay and survive the best they could. So many of our men had gone to the mines or to the Gulf to work, leaving their families fatherless. The sons were easy prey. The threats began to come closer to home. One day Ahmad Shah received a warning from unknown people that they would kill him, so for a while he left for Islamabad to try to raise awareness there of what was happening to our valley. One of the worst things about that period was when we started to doubt one another. Fingers were even pointed at my father. Our people are being killed, but this Zierdan is so outspoken and he's still alive. He must be a secret agent. Actually, he had been threatened too but hadn't told us. He had given a press conference in Peshawar demanding that the military act against the Taliban and go after the commanders. Afterwards people told him his name was heard on Mullah FM in a threat from Shah Durran. My father brushed it off. But I was worried. He was outspoken and involved in so many groups and committees that he often wouldn't come home till midnight. He started to sleep at one of his friends' houses to protect us in case the Taliban came for him. He couldn't bear the thought of being killed in front of us. I could not sleep until he returned and I could lock the gate. When he was at home, my mother would place a ladder in the backyard up to the outside wall so he could get down to the street below if he was in sudden danger. He laughed at the idea. Maybe Atul the squirrel could make it, but not me. My mother was always trying to think up plans for what she would do if the Taliban came. She thought of sleeping with a knife under her pillow. I said I could sneak into the toilet and call the police. My brothers and I thought of digging a tunnel. Once again I prayed for a magic wand to make the Taliban disappear. One day I saw my little brother Atul digging furiously in the garden. "What are you doing?" I asked him. "Making a grave," he said. Our news bulletins were full of killings and deaths, so it was natural for Atul to think of coffins and graves. Instead of hide and seek and cops and robbers, children were now playing army versus Taliban. They made rockets from branches and used sticks for Kalashnikovs. These were the sports of terror. There was no one to protect us. Our own deputy commissioner, Syed Javed, was going to Taliban meetings, praying in their mosque and leading their meetings. He became a perfect Talib. One target of the Taliban were non-governmental organizations or NGOs, which they said were anti-Islam. When the NGOs received threatening letters from the Taliban and went to the DC to ask for his help, he wouldn't even listen to them. Once in a meeting my father challenged him, "Whose orders are you representing? Fazlullah's or the government's?" We say in Arabic, people follow the king. When the highest authority in your district joins the Taliban, then Talibanization becomes normal. We like conspiracy theories in Pakistan, and we had many. Some believed the authorities were deliberately encouraging the Taliban. They said the army wanted the Taliban in Swat because the Americans wanted to use an airbase there to launch the drones. With the Taliban in the valley, our government could say to the Americans, "We can't help you because we have our own problems." It was also a way to answer growing American criticism that our military was helping the Taliban rather than trying to stop them. Now our government could respond, "You say we are taking your money and aiding these terrorists, but if that's the case, why are they attacking us too?" The Taliban obviously have the support of unseen forces, said my father. But what's happening is not simple, and the more you want to understand, the more complex it becomes. That year, 2008, the government even released Sufi Muhammad, the founder of the TNSM, from prison. He was said to be more moderate than his son-in-law Fazlullah, and there was hope that he would make a peace deal with the government to impose Sharia law in Swat and release us from Taliban violence. My father was in favor of this. We knew this would not be the end, but my father argued that if we had Sharia, the Taliban would have nothing more to fight for. They should then put down their arms and live like ordinary men. If they did not, he said, this would expose them for what they really were. The army still had the guns trained on the mountains overlooking Mingora. We would lie in bed listening to them boom boom all night. They would stop for 5, 10 or 15 minutes and then start again the moment we drifted off to sleep. Sometimes we covered our ears or buried our heads under pillows, but the guns were close by and the noise was too loud to block out. Then the morning after, on TV, we would hear of more Taliban killings and wonder what the army was doing with all its booming cannons and why they could not even stop the daily broadcasts on Mullah FM. Both the army and the Taliban were powerful. Sometimes their roadblocks were less than a kilometer apart on the same main roads. They would stop us but seemed unaware of each other's presence. It was unbelievable. No one understood why we were not being defended. People would say they were two sides of the same coin. My father said we common people were like chaff caught between the two stones of a water mill. But he still wasn't afraid. He said we should continue to speak out. I am only human, and when I heard the guns my heart used to beat very fast. Sometimes I was very afraid but I said nothing, and it didn't mean I would stop going to school. But fear is very powerful, and in the end it was this fear that had made people turn against Shabana. Terror had made people cruel. The Taliban bulldozed both our Pashtun values and the values of Islam. I tried to distract myself by reading Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, which answered big questions such as how the universe began and whether time could run backwards. I was only 11 years old and already I wished it could. We Pashtuns know the stone of revenge never decays, and when you do something wrong you will face the music. But when would that be? We continually asked ourselves. 13. The Diary of Gul Makai. It was during one of those dark days that my father received a call from his friend Abdul Hai Kakar, a BBC radio correspondent based in Peshawar. He was looking for a female teacher or a schoolgirl to write a diary about life under the Taliban. He wanted to show the human side of the catastrophe in Swat. Initially Madam Maryam's younger sister Aisha agreed, but her father found out and refused his permission, saying it was too risky. When I overheard my father talking about this, I said, why not me? I wanted people to know what was happening. Education is our right, I said. Just as it is our right to sing. Islam has given us this right and says that every girl and boy should go to school. The Quran says we should seek knowledge, study hard and learn the mysteries of our world. I had never written a diary before and didn't know how to begin. Although we had a computer, there were frequent power cuts and few places had internet access. Sahai Kaka would call me in the evening on my mother's mobile. He used his wife's phone to protect us as he said his own phone was bugged by the intelligence services. He would guide me, asking me questions about my day, and asking me to tell him small anecdotes or talk about my dreams. We would speak for half an hour or 45 minutes in Urdu, even though we are both Pashtun, as the blog was to appear in Urdu and he wanted the voice to be as authentic as possible. Then he wrote up my words and once a week they would appear on the BBC Urdu website. He told me about Anne Frank, a 13-year-old Jewish girl who hid from the Nazis with her family in Amsterdam during the war. He told me she kept a diary about their lives all crammed together, about how they spent the days and about her own feelings. It was very sad as in the end the family was betrayed and arrested and Anne died in a concentration camp when she was only 15. Later her diary was published and is a very powerful record. Hai Kaka told me it could be dangerous to use my real name and gave me the pseudonym Gul Makai, which means cornflower, and is the name of the heroine in a Pashtun folk story. It's a kind of Romeo and Juliet story in which Gul Makai and Musa Khan meet at school and fall in love. But they are from different tribes so their love causes a war. However, unlike Shakespeare's play, the story doesn't end in tragedy. Gul Makai uses the Quran to teach her elders that war is bad and they eventually stop fighting and allow the lovers to unite. My first diary entry appeared on the 3rd of January 2009 under the heading I am afraid. I had a terrible dream last night filled with military helicopters and Taliban. I have had such dreams since the launch of the military operation in Swat. I wrote about being afraid to go to school because of the Taliban edict and looking over my shoulder all the time. I also described something that happened on my way home from school. I heard a man behind me saying, "I will kill you." I quickened my pace and after a while I looked back to see if he was following me. To my huge relief I saw he was speaking on his phone. He must have been talking to someone else. It was thrilling to see my words on the website. I was a bit shy to start with, but after a while I got to know the kind of things Hai Kaka wanted me to talk about and became more confident. He liked personal feelings and what he called my pungent sentences, and also the mix of everyday family life with the terror of the Taliban. I wrote a lot about school as that was at the center of our lives. I loved my royal blue school uniform, but we were advised to wear plain clothes instead and hide our books under our shawls. One extract was called "Do Not Wear Colorful Clothes." In it I wrote, I was getting ready for school one day and was about to put on my uniform when I remembered the advice of our principal, so that day I decided to wear my favorite pink dress. I also wrote about the burqa. When you're very young, you love the burqa because it's great for dressing up. But when you are made to wear it, that's a different matter. Also, it makes walking difficult. One of my diary entries was about an incident that happened when I was out shopping with my mother and cousin in the China Bazaar. There we heard gossip that one day a woman was wearing a shuttlecock burqa and fell over. When a man tried to help her, she refused and said, "Don't help me, brother, as this will bring immense pleasure to Fazlullah." When we entered the shop we were going to, the shopkeeper laughed and told us he got scared thinking we might be suicide bombers, as many suicide bombers wore the burqa. At school people started talking about the diary. One girl even printed it out and brought it in to show my father. "It's very good," he said with a knowing smile. I wanted to tell people it was me, but the BBC correspondent had told me not to as it could be dangerous. I didn't see why, as I was just a child and who would attack a child. but some of my friends recognized incidents in it. And I almost gave the game away in one entry when I said, my mother liked my pen name Gul Makai and joked to my father we should change my name. I also like the name because my real name means grief-stricken. The Diary of Gul Makai received attention further afield. Some newspapers printed extracts. The BBC even made a recording of it using another girl's voice, and I began to see that the pen and the words that come from it can be much more powerful than machine guns, tanks or helicopters. We were learning how to struggle. And we were learning how powerful we are when we speak. Some of our teachers stopped coming to school. One said he had been ordered by Mullah Fazlullah to help build his center in Imam Derry. Another said he'd seen a beheaded corpse on the way in and could no longer risk his life to teach. Many people were scared. Our neighbors said the Taliban were instructing people to make it known to the mosque if the daughters were unmarried so they could be married off, probably to militants. By the start of January 2009, there were only 10 girls in my class when once there had been 27. Many of my friends had left the valley so they could be educated in Peshawar, but my father insisted we would not leave. Swat has given us so much. In these tough days we must be strong for our valley, he said. One night we all went for dinner at the house of my father's friend Dr. Afzal, who runs a hospital. After dinner, when the doctor was driving us home, we saw masked Taliban on both sides of the road carrying guns. We were terrified. Dr. Afzal's hospital was in an area that had been taken over by the Taliban. The constant gunfire and curfews had made it impossible for the hospital to function, so he had moved it to Barakot. There had been an outcry, and the Taliban spokesman Muslim Khan had called on the doctor to reopen it. He had asked for my father's advice. My father told him, don't accept good things from bad people. A hospital protected by the Taliban was not a good idea, so he refused. Dr. Afzal did not live far from us, so once we were safely home, my father insisted on going back with him in case he was targeted by the Taliban. As he and my father drove back, Dr. Afzal nervously asked him, what names shall we give if they stop us? You are Dr. Afzal and I am Zaidan Yusufzai, replied my father. These bloody people. We haven't done anything wrong. Why should we change our names? That's what criminals do. Fortunately the Taliban had disappeared. We all breathed a big sigh of relief when my father phoned to say they were safe. I didn't want to give in either. But the Taliban's deadline was drawing closer. Girls had to stop going to school. How could they stop more than 50,000 girls from going to school in the 21st century? I kept hoping something would happen and the schools would remain open. But finally the deadline was upon us. We were determined that the Kushal school bell would be the last to stop ringing. Madam Mayam had even got married so she could stay in Swat. Her family had moved to Karachi to get away from the conflict and, as a woman, she could not live alone. Wednesday the 14th of January was the day my school closed, and when I woke up that morning I saw TV cameras in my bedroom. A Pakistani journalist called Irfan Ashraf was following me around, even as I said my prayers and brushed my teeth. I could tell my father was in a bad mood. One of his friends had persuaded him to participate in a documentary for the New York Times website to show the world what was happening to us. A few weeks before, we had met the American video journalist Adam Ellick in Peshawar. It was a funny meeting as he conducted a long interview with my father in English and I didn't say a word. Then he asked if he could talk to me and began asking questions using Irfan as an interpreter. After about 10 minutes of this he realized from my facial expressions that I could understand him perfectly. You speak English? He asked me. Yes, I was just saying there is a fear in my heart, I replied. Adam was astonished. What's wrong with you people? He asked Irfan and my father. She speaks better English than the rest of you and you're translating for her. We all laughed. The original idea for the documentary had been to follow my father on the last day of school, but at the end of the meeting Irfan asked me, what would you do if there comes a day when you can't go back to your valley and school? I said this wouldn't happen. Then he insisted and I started to weep. I think it was then that Adam decided he should focus on me. Adam could not come to Swat because it was too dangerous for foreigners. When Irfan and a cameraman arrived in Mingora, our uncle, who was staying with us, said over and over that it was too risky to have cameras in our house. My father also kept telling him to hide the cameras. But they had come a long way and it's hard for us as Pashtuns to refuse hospitality. Besides, my father knew this could be our megaphone to the outside world. His friend had told him it would make far more impact than him roaming from pillar to post. I had done a lot of television interviews and enjoyed speaking into the microphone so much that my friends would tease me. But I had never done anything like this. Be natural, Irfan told me. That wasn't easy with a camera trained on me everywhere I went, even as I brushed my teeth. I showed him the uniform I couldn't wear and told him I was scared that if the Taliban caught me going to school they would throw acid in my face as they had done to girls in Afghanistan. We had a special assembly that final morning, but it was hard to hear with the noise of helicopters overhead. Some of us spoke out against what was happening in our valley. The bell rang for the very last time, and then Madam Mayam announced it was the winter holidays. But unlike in other years, no date was announced for the start of next term. Even so, some teachers still gave us homework. In the yard I hugged all my friends. I looked at the honors board and wondered if my name would ever appear on it again. Exams were due in March, but how could they take place? Coming first didn't matter if you couldn't study at all. When someone takes away your pens you realize quite how important education is. Before I closed the school door I looked back as if it were the last time I would ever be at school. That's the closing shot in one part of the documentary. In reality I went back and sighed. My friends and I didn't want that day to end, so we decided to stay on for a while longer. We went to the primary school where there was more space to run around and played cops and robbers. Then we played Mango Mango, where you make a circle and sing, then when the song stops everyone has to freeze. Anyone who moves or laughs is out. We came home from school late that day. Usually we leave at 1 p.m. but that day we stayed till 3. Before we left, Moniba and I had an argument over something so silly I can't remember what it was. Our friends couldn't believe it. You two always argue when there's an important occasion. They said. It wasn't a good way to leave things. I told the documentary makers, they cannot stop me. I will get my education if it's at home, school or somewhere else. This is our request to the world, to save our schools, save our Pakistan, save our Swat. When I got home, I cried and cried. I didn't want to stop learning. I was only 11 years old, but I felt as though I had lost everything. I had told everyone in my class that the Taliban wouldn't go through with it. They're just like our politicians, they talk the talk but they won't do anything, I'd said. But then they went ahead and closed our school and I felt embarrassed. I couldn't control myself. I was crying, my mother was crying, but my father insisted, you will go to school. For him the closing of the schools also meant the loss of business. The boys' school would reopen after the winter holidays, but the loss of the girls' school represented a big cut in our income. More than half the school fees were overdue and my father spent the last day chasing money to pay the rent, the utility bills and the teachers' salaries. That night the air was full of artillery fire and I woke up 3 times. The next morning everything had changed. I began to think that maybe I should go to Peshawar or abroad, or maybe I could ask our teachers to form a secret school in our home, as some Afghans had done during Taliban rule. Afterwards I went on as many radio and TV channels as possible. They can stop us going to school but they can't stop us learning, I said. I sounded hopeful but in my heart I was worried. My father and I went to Peshawar and visited lots of places to tell people what was happening. I spoke of the irony of the Taliban wanting female teachers and doctors for women yet not letting girls go to school to qualify for these jobs. Once Muslim Khan had said girls should not go to school and learn Western ways. This from a man who had lived so long in America. He insisted he would have his own education system. What would Muslim Khan use instead of the stethoscope and the thermometer? My father asked, are there any Eastern instruments which will treat the sick? The Taliban is against education because they think that when a child reads a book or learns English or studies science, he or she will become westernized. But I said, education is education. We should learn everything and then choose which path to follow. Education is neither Eastern nor Western, it is human. My mother used to tell me to hide my face when I spoke to the media because at my age I should be in purdah and she was afraid for my safety. But she never banned me from doing anything. It was a time of horror and fear. People often said the Taliban might kill my father but not me. Malala is a child, they would say, and even the Taliban don't kill children. But my grandmother wasn't so sure. Whenever my grandmother saw me speaking on television, or leaving the house, she would pray, please God make Malala like Benazir Bhutto but do not give her Benazir's short life. After my school closed down I continued to write the blog. 4 days after the ban on girls' schools, 5 more were destroyed. I am quite surprised, I wrote, because these schools had closed, so why did they also need to be destroyed? No one has gone to school following the Taliban's deadline. The army is doing nothing about it. They are sitting in the bunkers on top of the hills. They slaughter goats and eat with pleasure. I also wrote about people going to watch the floggings announced on Mullah FM, and the fact that the police were nowhere to be seen. One day we got a call from America, from a student at Stanford University. Her name was Shiza Shaheed and she came from Islamabad. She had seen the New York Times documentary Class Dismissed in Swat Valley and tracked us down. We saw then the power of the media and she became a great support to us. My father was almost bursting with pride at how I came across on the documentary. Look at her, he told Adam Elick. Don't you think she is meant for the skies? Fathers can be very embarrassing. Adam took us to Islamabad. It was the first time I had ever visited. Islamabad was a beautiful place with nice white bungalows and broad roads, though it has none of the natural beauty of Swat. We saw the Red Mosque where the siege had taken place, the wide Constitution Avenue leading to the white colonnaded buildings of the Parliament House and the Presidency, where Zardari now lived. General Musharraf was in exile in London. We went to shops where I bought school books and Adam bought me DVDs of American TV programs like Ugly Betty, which was about a girl with big braces and a big heart. I loved it and dreamed of one day going to New York and working on a magazine like her. We visited the Lokversa Museum, and it was a joy to celebrate our national heritage once again. Our own museum in Swat had closed. On the steps outside an old man was selling popcorn. He was a Pashtun like us, and when my father asked if he was from Islamabad he replied, do you think Islamabad can ever belong to us Pashtuns? He said he came from Momand, one of the tribal areas, but had to flee because of a military operation. I saw tears in my parents' eyes. Lots of buildings were surrounded by concrete blocks, and there were checkpoints for incoming vehicles to guard against suicide bombs. When our bus hit a pothole on the way back, my brother Kushal, who had been asleep, jerked awake. Was that a bomb blast? He asked. This was the fear that filled our daily lives. Any small disturbance or noise could be a bomb or gunfire. On our short trips we forgot our troubles in Swat. But we returned to the threats and danger as we entered our valley once again. Even so, Swat was our home and we were not ready to leave it. Back in Mingora the first thing I saw when I opened my wardrobe was my uniform, school bag and geometry set. I felt so sad. The visit to Islamabad had been a lovely break, but this was my reality now. 14. A funny kind of peace. When my brother's schools reopened after the winter break, Kushal said he would rather stay at home like me. I was cross. You don't realize how lucky you are. I told him. It felt strange to have no school. We didn't even have a television set as someone had stolen ours while we were in Islamabad, using my father's getaway ladder to get inside. Someone gave me a copy of The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, a fable about a shepherd boy who travels to the pyramids in search of treasure when all the time it's at home. I loved that book and read it over and over again. When you want something, all the universe conspires in helping you achieve it, it says. I don't think that Paulo Coelho had come across the Taliban or our useless politicians. What I didn't know was that Haikakar was holding secret talks with Fazlullah and his commanders. He had got to know them in interviews, and was urging them to rethink the ban on girls' education. Listen, Maulana, he told Fazlullah. You killed people, you slaughtered people, you beheaded people, you destroyed schools, and still there was no protest in Pakistan. But when you banned girls' education, people spoke out. Even the Pakistan media, which has been so soft on you till now, is outraged. The pressure from the whole country worked, and Fazlullah agreed to lift the ban for girls up to 10 years old, year 4. I was in year 5 and some of us pretended we were younger than we were. We started going to school again, dressed in ordinary clothes and hiding our books under our shawls. It was risky, but it was the only ambition I had back then. We were lucky too that Madam Mayam was brave and resisted the pressure to stop working. She had known my father since she was 10 and they trusted each other completely. She used to signal to him to wind up when he spoke for too long, which was often. The secret school is our silent protest, she told us. I didn't write anything about it in my diary. If they had caught us, they would have flogged or even slaughtered us as they had Shabana. Some people are afraid of ghosts, some of spiders or snakes. In those days we were afraid of our fellow human beings. On the way to school I sometimes saw the Taliban with the caps and long dirty hair. Most of the time they hid the faces. They were awkward, horrible looking. The streets of Mingora were very empty as a third of the inhabitants had left the valley. My father said you couldn't really blame people for leaving as the government had no power. There were now 12,000 army troops in the region, 4 times as many as their estimates of the Taliban, along with tanks, helicopters and sophisticated weapons. Yet 70% of Swat was under Taliban control. About a week after we had returned to school, on the 16th of February 2009, we were woken one night by the sound of gunfire. Our people traditionally fire rifles in celebration of births and weddings, but even that had stopped during the conflict. So at first we thought we were in danger. Then we heard the news. The gunfire was in celebration. A peace deal had been struck between the Taliban and the provincial government, which was now under the control of the ANP, not the mullahs. The government had agreed to impose Sharia law throughout Swat, and in return the militants would stop fighting. The Taliban agreed to a 10-day truce and, as a peace gesture, released a Chinese telephone engineer who they had kidnapped 6 months before. We were happy too. My father and I had often spoken in favor of a peace deal, but we questioned how it would work. People hoped that the Taliban would settle down, go back to their homes and live as peaceful citizens. They convinced themselves that the Shariat in Swat would be different to the Afghan version. We would still have our girls' schools and there would be no morality police. Swat would be Swat, just with a different justice system. I wanted to believe this, but I was worried. I thought, surely how the system works depends on the people overseeing it. The Taliban. And it was hard to believe it was all over. More than 1,000 ordinary people and police had been killed. Women had been kept in purdah, schools and bridges had been blown up, businesses had closed. We had suffered barbaric public courts and violent justice and had lived in a constant state of fear. And now it was all to stop. At breakfast I suggested to my brothers that we should talk of peace now and not of war. As ever, they ignored me and carried on with their war games. Kushal had a toy helicopter and Atul a pistol made of paper, and one would shout, "Fire!" and the other, "Take position." I didn't care. I went and looked at my uniform, happy that I would soon be able to wear it openly. A message came from our headmistress that exams would take place in the first week of March. It was time to get back to my books. Our excitement did not last long. Just 2 days later I was on the roof of the Taj Mahal Hotel giving an interview about the peace deal to a well-known reporter called Hamid Mir when we got the news that another TV reporter we knew had been killed. His name was Musa Khan Keel, and he had often interviewed my father. That day he had been covering a peace march led by Sufi Muhammad. It wasn't really a march but a cavalcade of cars. Afterwards Musa Khan's body was found nearby. He had been shot several times and his throat partly slit. He was 28 years old. My mother was so upset when we told her that she went to bed in tears. She was worried that violence had returned to the valley so soon after the peace deal. Was the deal merely an illusion? She wondered. A few days later, on the 22nd of February, a permanent ceasefire was announced by Deputy Commissioner Syed Javed at the Swat Press Club in Mingora. He appealed to all Swatis to return. The Taliban spokesman Muslim Khan then confirmed they had agreed an indefinite ceasefire. President Zardari would sign the peace deal into law. The government also agreed to pay compensation to the families of victims. Everyone in Swat was jubilant, but I felt the happiest because it meant school would reopen properly. The Taliban said girls could go to school after the peace agreement but they should be veiled and covered. We said okay, if that's what you want, as long as we can live our lives. Not everyone was happy about the deal. Our American allies were furious. I think the Pakistan government is basically abdicating to the Taliban and the extremists, said Hillary Clinton, the U.S. Secretary of State. The Americans were worried the deal meant surrender. The Pakistani newspaper Dawn wrote in an editorial that the deal sent a disastrous signal: fight the state militarily and it will give you what you want and get nothing in return. But none of those people had to live here. We needed peace whoever brought it. In our case it happened to be a white-bearded militant called Sufi Muhammad. He made a peace camp in Deer and Saturday there in our famous mosque Tabligh Markaz, like the master of our land. He was the guarantor that the Taliban would lay down their arms and there would be peace in the valley. People visited him to pay homage and kiss his hand because they were tired of war and suicide bombings. In March I stopped writing my blog as Haikaka thought there was not much more to say. But to our horror things didn't change much. If anything the Taliban became even more barbaric. They were now state-sanctioned terrorists. We were disillusioned and disappointed. The peace deal was merely a mirage. One night the Taliban held what we call a flag march near our street and patrolled the roads with guns and sticks as if they were the army. They were still patrolling the China Bazaar. One day my mother went shopping with my cousin as she was getting married and wanted to buy things for her wedding. A Talib accosted them and blocked their way. "If I see you again wearing a scarf but no burqa I will beat you," he said. My mother is not easily scared and remained composed. "Yes, okay. We will wear burqas in future," she told him. My mother always covers her head but the burqa is not part of our Pashtun tradition. We also heard that Taliban had attacked a shopkeeper because an unaccompanied woman was looking at the lipsticks in his beauty shop. There is a banner in the market saying women are not allowed to be in your shop unaccompanied by a male relative and you have defied us, they said. He was badly beaten and nobody helped him. One day I saw my father and his friends watching a video on his phone. It was a shocking scene. A teenage girl wearing a black burqa and red trousers was lying face down on the ground being flogged in broad daylight by a bearded man in a black turban. "Please stop it," she begged in Pashto in between screams and whimpers as each blow was delivered. "In the name of Allah, I am dying." You could hear the Taliban shouting, "Hold her down. Hold her hands down." At one point during the flogging her burqa slips and they stop for a moment to adjust it then carry on beating her. They hit her 34 times. A crowd had gathered but did nothing. One of the woman's relatives even volunteered to help hold her down. A few days later the video was everywhere. A woman filmmaker in Islamabad got hold of it and it was shown on Pakistan TV over and over, and then round the world. People were rightly outraged, but this reaction seemed odd to us as it showed they had no idea of the awful things going on in our valley. I wish their outrage extended to the Taliban's banning of girls' education. Prime Minister Yusuf Raza Gilani called for an inquiry and made a statement saying the flogging of the girl was against the teachings of Islam. Islam teaches us to treat women politely, he said. Some people even claimed the video was fake. Others said that the flogging had taken place in January, before the peace deal, and had been released now to sabotage it. But Muslim Khan confirmed it was genuine. She came out of her house with a man who was not her husband, so we had to punish her, he said. Some boundaries cannot be crossed. Around the same time in early April, another well-known journalist called Zahid Hussain came to Swat. He went to visit the DC at his official residence and found him hosting what appeared to be a celebration of the Taliban takeover. There were several senior Taliban commanders with armed escorts including Muslim Khan and even Fakir Muhammad, the leader of the militants in Bajor, who were in the middle of a bloody fight with the army. Fakir had a $200,000 bounty on his head, yet there he was sitting in a government official's house having dinner. We also heard that an army brigadier went to prayers led by Fazlullah. There cannot be two swords in one sheath, said one of my father's friends. There cannot be two kings in one land. Who is in charge here, the government or Fazlullah? But we still believed in peace. Everyone was looking forward to a big outdoor public meeting on the 20th of April when Sufi Muhammad would address the people of Swat. We were all at home that morning. My father and brothers were standing outside when a group of teenage Taliban went past playing victory songs on their mobiles. Oh, look at 'em, Abba, said Kushal. If I had a Kalashnikov I would kill them. It was a perfect spring day. Everyone was excited because they hoped Sufi Muhammad would proclaim peace and victory and ask the Taliban to lay down their arms. My father didn't attend the gathering. He watched it from the roof of Sarosh Academy, the school run by his friend Ahmad Shah, where he and other activists often gathered in the evenings. The roof overlooked the stage, so some media had set up the cameras there. There was a huge crowd, between 30,000 and 40,000 people, wearing turbans and singing Taliban and jihadi songs. It was complete Talibanization humming, said my father. Liberal progressives like him did not enjoy the singing and chanting. They thought it was toxic, especially at times like this. Sufi Muhammad was sitting on the stage with a long queue of people waiting to pay homage. The meeting started with recitations from the chapter of victory, a surah from the Quran, followed by speeches from different leaders in the 5 districts of our valley, Kohistan, Malakand, Shangla, Upper Deer and Lower Deer. They were all very enthusiastic as each one was hoping to be made the emir of the district so they could be in charge of imposing Shariat. Later these leaders would be killed or thrown in jail, but back then they dreamed of power. So everyone spoke with great authority, celebrating like the Prophet when he conquered Mecca, though his speech was one of forgiveness, not cruel victory. Then it was Sufi Muhammad's turn. He was not a good speaker. He was very old and seemed in poor health and rambled on for 45 minutes. He said totally unexpected things as if he had someone else's tongue in his mouth. He described Pakistan's courts as un-Islamic and said, I consider Western democracy a system imposed on us by the infidels. Islam does not allow democracy or elections. Sufi Muhammad said nothing about education. He didn't tell the Taliban to lay down their arms and leave the Hujras. Instead he appeared to threaten the whole nation. Now wait, we are coming to Islamabad, he shouted. We were shocked. It was like when you pour water onto a blazing fire, the flames are suddenly extinguished. People were bitterly disappointed and started abusing him. What did that devil say? People asked. He's not for peace, he wants more killing. My mother put it best. He had the chance to be the hero of history but didn't take it, she said. Our mood on the way home was the exact opposite of what we had felt on the way to the meeting. That night my father spoke on GOTV and told Kamran Khan that people had had high hopes but were disappointed. Sufi Muhammad didn't do what he should have done. He was supposed to seal the peace deal with a speech calling for reconciliation and an end to violence. People had different conspiracy theories about what had happened. Some said Sufi Muhammad had gone mad. Others said he had been ordered to deliver this speech and been warned, if you don't, there are 4 or 5 suicide bombers who will blast you and everyone there. People said he had looked uneasy on stage before he spoke. They muttered about hidden hands and unseen forces. What does it matter? I wondered. The point is we are a Taliban state. My father was again busy speaking at seminars on our troubles with the Taliban. But one, the information minister for our province said Talibanization was the result of our country's policy of training militants and sending them to Afghanistan, first to fight the Russians, then to fight the Americans. If we had not put guns in the hands of madrasa students at the behest of foreign powers, we would not be facing this bloodbath in the tribal areas and Swat, he said. It soon became clear that the Americans had been right in their assessment of the deal. The Taliban believed the Pakistani government had given in and they could do what they liked. They streamed into Bunna, the next district to the southeast of Swat and only 65 miles from Islamabad. People in Bunna had always resisted the Taliban, but they were ordered by the local authorities not to fight. As the militants arrived with their RPGs and guns, the police abandoned the posts, saying the Taliban had superior weapons, and people fled. The Taliban set up Shariat courts in all districts and broadcast sermons from mosques calling on the local youth to join them. Just as they had in Swat, they burned TV sets, pictures, DVDs and tapes. They even took control of the famous shrine of a Sufi saint, Pir Baba, which was a pilgrimage site. People would visit to pray for spiritual guidance, cures for their ailments and even happy marriages for the children. But now it was locked and bolted. People in the lower districts of Pakistan became very worried as the Taliban moved towards the capital. Everyone seemed to have seen the video of the girl in the black burqa being flogged and were asking, is this what we want in Pakistan? Militants had killed Benazir, blown up the country's best-known hotel, killed thousands of people in suicide bombings and beheadings and destroyed hundreds of schools. What more would it take for the army and government to resist them? In Washington, the government of President Obama had just announced it was sending 21,000 more troops to Afghanistan to turn round the war against the Taliban. But now they seem to be more alarmed about Pakistan than Afghanistan. Not because of girls like me and my school, but because our country has more than 200 nuclear warheads and they were worried about who was going to control them. They talked about stopping the billions of dollars in aid and sending troops instead. At the start of May, our army launched Operation True Path to drive the Taliban out of Swat. We heard they were dropping hundreds of commandos from helicopters into the mountains in the north. More troops appeared in Mingora too. This time they would clear the town. They announced over megaphones that all residents should leave. My father said we should stay. But the gunfire kept us awake most nights. Everyone was in a continuous state of anxiety. One night we were woken up by screaming. We had recently got some pets, 3 white chickens and a white rabbit that one of Kushal's friends had given him and which we let wander around the house. Atul was only 5 then and really loved that rabbit, so it used to sleep under my parents' bed. But it used to wee everywhere, so that night we put it outside. Around midnight a cat came and killed it. We all heard the rabbit's agonized cries. Atul would not stop weeping. Let the sun come and I will teach that cat a lesson tomorrow, he said. I will kill him. It seemed like a bad omen. 15. Leaving the valley. Leaving the valley was harder than anything I had done before. I remembered the tapa my grandmother used to recite, no Pashtun leaves his land of his own sweet wool. Either he leaves from poverty or he leaves for love. Now we were being driven out for a third reason the Tapa writer had never imagined, the Taliban. Leaving our home felt like having my heart ripped out. I stood on our roof looking at the mountains, the snow-topped Mount Elam where Alexander the Great had reached up and touched Jupiter. I looked at the trees all coming into leaf. The fruit of our apricot tree might be eaten by someone else this year. Everything was silent, pin drop silent. There was no sound from the river or the wind, even the birds were not chirping. I wanted to cry because I felt in my heart I might never see my home again. The documentary makers had asked me how I would feel if one day I left Swat and never came back. At the time I had thought it was a stupid question, but now I saw that everything I could not imagine happening had happened. I thought my school would not close and it had. I thought we would never leave Swat and we were just about to. I thought Swat would be free of the Taliban one day and we would rejoice, but now I realized that might not happen. I started to cry. It was as if everyone had been waiting for someone else to start. My cousin's wife, Honey, started weeping, then all of us were crying. But my mother was very composed and courageous. I put all my books and notebooks in my school bag, then packed another bag of clothes. I couldn't think straight. I took the trousers from one set and the top from another, so I had a bag of things which didn't match. I didn't take any of my school awards or photos or personal belongings as we were traveling in someone else's car and there was little room. We didn't own anything expensive like a laptop or jewelry. Our only valuable items had been our TV, a fridge and a washing machine. We didn't lead a life of luxury. We Pashtuns prefer to sit on floors rather than chairs. Our house has holes in the walls, and every plate and cup is cracked. My father had resisted leaving till the end. But then some of my parents' friends had lost a relative in gunfire, so they went to the house to offer prayers of condolences even though nobody was really venturing out. Seeing the grief made my mother determined to leave. She told my father, "You don't have to come, but I am going and I will take the children to Shangla." She knew he couldn't let her go alone. My mother had had enough of the gunfire and tension and called Dr. Afzal and begged him to persuade my father to leave. He and his family were going, so they offered us a lift. We didn't have a car, so we were lucky that our neighbors, Safina and her family, were also leaving and could fit some of us in their car while the rest would go with Dr. Afzal. On the 5th of May 2009 we became IDPs. Internally displaced persons. It sounded like a disease. There were a lot of us, not just us 5 but also my grandmother, my cousin, his wife, Honey, and the baby. My brothers also wanted to take the pet chickens. Mine had died because I washed it in cold water on a winter's day. It wouldn't revive even when I put it in a shoebox in the house to keep it warm and got everyone in the neighborhood to pray for it. My mother refused to let the chickens come. "What if they make a mess in the car?" she asked. Atul suggested we buy them nappies. In the end, we left them with a lot of water and corn. She also said I must leave my school bag because there was so little room. I was horrified. I went and whispered Quranic verses over the books to try and protect them. Finally everyone was ready. My mother, father, grandmother, my cousin's wife and baby and my brothers all squashed into the back of Dr. Afzal's van along with his wife and children. There were children in the laps of adults and smaller children in their laps. I was luckier, there were fewer people in Safina's car, but I was devastated by the loss of my school bag. Because I had packed my books separately, I had had to leave them all behind. We all said surahs from the Quran and a special prayer to protect our sweet homes and school. Then Safina's father put his foot on the pedal and away we drove out of the small world of our street, home and school and into the unknown. We did not know if we would ever see our town again. We had seen pictures of how the army had flattened everything in an operation against militants in Bajaur and we thought everything we knew would be destroyed. The streets were jam-packed. I had never seen them so busy before. There were cars everywhere, as well as rickshaws, mule carts and trucks laden with people and the belongings. There were even motorbikes with entire families balanced on them. Thousands of people were leaving with just the clothes they had on the backs. It felt as if the whole valley was on the move. Some people believe that the Pashtuns descend from one of the lost tribes of Israel, and my father said, "It is as though we are the Israelites leaving Egypt, but we have no Moses to guide us." Few people knew where they were going, they just knew they had to leave. This was the biggest exodus in Pashtun history. Usually there are many ways out of Mingora, but the Taliban had cut down several huge apple trees and used them to block some routes so everyone was squashed onto the same road. We were an ocean of people. The Taliban patrolled the roads with guns and watched us from the tops of buildings. They were keeping the cars in lines but with weapons, not whistles. Traffic Taliban, we joked to try and keep our spirits up. At regular intervals along the road we passed Army and Taliban checkpoints side by side. Once again the Army was seemingly unaware of the Taliban's presence. Maybe they have poor eyesight, we laughed, and can't see them. The road was heaving with traffic. It was a long slow journey and we were all very sweaty, crammed in together. Usually car journeys are an adventure for us children as we rarely go anywhere. But this was different. Everyone was depressed. Inside Dr. Afzal's van my father was talking to the media, giving a running commentary on the exodus from the valley. My mother kept telling him to keep his voice down for fear the Taliban would hear him. My father's voice is so loud my mother often jokes that he doesn't need to make phone calls, he can just shout. Finally we got through the mountain pass at Malakand and left Swat behind. It was late afternoon by the time we reached Mardan, which is a hot and busy city. My father kept insisting to everyone, "In a few days we will return. Everything will be fine." But we knew that was not true. In Mardan there were already big camps of white UNHCR tents like those for Afghan refugees in Peshawar. We weren't going to stay in the camps because it was the worst idea ever. Almost 2 million of us were fleeing Swat and you couldn't have fitted 2 million people in those camps. Even if there was a tent for us, it was far too hot inside and there was talk that diseases like cholera were spreading. My father said he had heard rumors that some Taliban were even hiding inside the camps and harassing the women. Those who could stayed in the homes of local people or with family and friends. Amazingly, 3/4 of all the IDPs were put up by the people of Mardan and the nearby town of Swabi. They opened the doors of their homes, schools and mosques to the refugees. In our culture women are expected not to mix with men they are not related to. In order to protect women's purdah, men in families hosting the refugees even slept away from their own homes. They became voluntary IDPs. It was an astonishing example of Pashtun hospitality. We were convinced that if the exodus had been managed by the government many more would have died of hunger and illness. As we had no relatives in Mardan we were planning to make our way to Shangla, our family village. So far we had driven in the opposite direction, but we had had to take the only lift we could get out of Swat. We spent that first night in the home of Dr. Afzal. My father then left us to go to Peshawar and alert people to what was happening. He promised to meet us later in Shangla. My mother tried very hard to persuade him to come with us but he refused. He wanted the people of Peshawar and Islamabad to be aware of the terrible conditions in which IDPs were living and that the military were doing nothing. We said goodbye and were terribly worried we wouldn't see him again. The next day we got a lift to Abbottabad, where my grandmother's family lived. There we met up with my cousin Kanji, who was heading north like us. He ran a boys' hostel in Swat and was taking 7 or 8 boys to Kohistan by coach. He was going to Bisham, from where we would need another lift to take us to Shangla. It was nightfall by the time we reached Bisham as many roads were blocked. We spent the night in a cheap dirty hotel while my cousin tried to arrange a van to take us to Shangla. A man came near my mother and she took her shoe off and hit him once then twice and he ran away. She had hit him so hard that when she looked at the shoe it was broken. I always knew my mother was a strong woman, but I looked at her with new respect. It was not easy to get from Bisham to our village, and we had to walk 25 kilometers carrying all our things. At one point we were stopped by the army, who told us we could go no further and must turn back. Our home is in Shangla. Where will we go? We begged. My grandmother started crying and saying her life had never been so bad. Finally, they let us through. The army and their machine guns were everywhere. Because of the curfew and the checkpoints, there was not one other vehicle on the road that didn't belong to the military. We were afraid that the army wouldn't know who we were and would shoot us. When we reached the village, our family was astonished to see us. Everyone believed the Taliban would return to Shangla, so they couldn't understand why we hadn't remained in Mardan. We stayed in my mother's village, Karshat, with my uncle Faiz Muhammad and his family. We had to borrow clothes from our relatives as we hadn't brought much. I was happy to be with my cousin Sumbul, who is a year older than me. Once we were settled, I started going to school with her. I was in year 6 but started in year 7 to be with Sumbul. There were only 3 girls in that year, as most of the village girls of that age do not go to school, so we were taught with boys as they didn't have enough room or staff to teach just 3 girls separately. I was different to the other girls as I didn't cover my face, and I used to talk to every teacher and ask questions. But I tried to be obedient and polite, always saying, "Yes, sir." It took over half an hour to walk to school, and because I am bad at getting up in the morning, the second day we were late. I was shocked when the teacher hit my hand with a stick to punish me, but then decided that at least it meant they were accepting me and not treating me differently. My uncle even gave me pocket money to buy snacks at school. They sold cucumber and watermelon, not sweets and crisps like in Mingora. One day at school there was a Parents' Day and prize-giving ceremony, and all the boys were encouraged to make speeches. Some of the girls also took part, but not in public. Instead we spoke into a microphone in our classrooms, and our voices were then projected into the main hall. But I was used to speaking in public, so I came out and in front of all the boys I recited one Naat, a poem in which I praised the Prophet. Then I asked the teacher if I could read some more poetry. I read a poem about working hard to achieve your heart's desires. A diamond must be cut many times before it yields even a tiny jewel, I said. After that I spoke of my namesake, Malala of Maiwand, who had strength and power equal to hundreds and thousands of brave men, because her few lines of poetry changed everything, so the British were defeated. People in the audience seemed surprised, and I wondered whether they thought I was showing off or whether they were asking themselves why I wasn't wearing a veil. It was nice being with my cousins, but I missed my books. I kept thinking of my school bag at home with copies of Oliver Twist and Romeo and Juliet waiting to be read, and the Ugly Betty DVDs on the shelf. But now we were living our own drama. We had been so happy, then something very bad had come into our lives, and we were now waiting for our happy ending. When I complained about my books, my brothers whined about the chickens. We'd heard on the radio that the army had started the battle for Mingora. They had parachuted in soldiers, and there had been hand-to-hand fighting in the streets. The Taliban were using hotels and government buildings as bunkers. After 4 days the military took 3 squares, including Green Chowk, where the Taliban used to display the beheaded bodies of their victims. Then they captured the airport, and in a week they had taken back the city. We continued to worry about my father. In Shangla it was hard to find a mobile phone signal. We had to climb onto a huge boulder in a field, and even then we rarely had more than 1 bar of reception, so we hardly ever spoke to him. But after we had been in Shangla for about 6 weeks, my father said we could travel to Peshawar, where he had been staying in one room with 3 friends. It was very emotional to see him again. Then, a complete family once more, we traveled down to Islamabad, where we stayed with the family of Shiza, the lady who had called us from Stanford. While we were there, we heard that Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, the American envoy to Pakistan and Afghanistan, was holding a meeting in the Serena Hotel about the conflict, and my father and I managed to get inside. We almost missed it as I hadn't set the alarm properly, so my father was barely speaking to me. Holbrooke was a big gruff man with a red face, but people said he had helped bring peace to Bosnia. I sat next to him and he asked me how old I was. I am 12, I replied, trying to look as tall as possible. Respected Ambassador, I request you, please help us girls to get an education, I said. He laughed. You already have lots of problems and we are doing lots for you, he replied. We have pledged billions of dollars in economic aid, we are working with your government on providing electricity, gas, but your country faces a lot of problems. I did an interview with a radio station called Power 99. They liked it very much and told us they had a guest house in Abbottabad where we could all go. We stayed there for a week and to my joy I heard Moniba was also in Abbottabad, as was one of our teachers and another friend. Moniba and I had not spoken since our fight on the last day before becoming IDPs. We arranged to meet in a park, and I brought her Pepsi and biscuits. It was all your fault, she told me. I agreed. I didn't mind, I just wanted to be friends. Our week at the guest house soon ended and we went to Haraipur, where one of my aunts lived. It was our 4th city in 2 months. I knew we were better off than those who lived in the camps, queuing for food and water for hours under the hot sun, but I missed my valley. It was there I spent my 12th birthday. Nobody remembered. Even my father forgot, he was so busy hopping about. I was upset and recalled how different my 11th birthday had been. I had shared a cake with my friends. There were balloons and I had made the same wish I was making on my 12th birthday, but this time there was no cake and there were no candles to blow out. Once again I wished for peace in our valley.